Hi everyone, Stepan here. It's Monday, so we are going to continue the series on Garry Kasparov. We are at the age of 11 now, so Kasparov was 10 or 11 years old. I'm not really sure about the month, but somewhere between that. And this game was played in Vilnius in 1973. It was a Fischer Sozin Sicilian, which is very interesting for the time because in 1972 Fischer had just beaten Boris Spassky, of course, shattering the Soviet dream of chess superiority. And the Fischer Sozin, of course, Sicilian was Fischer's main line with white, and he used to play this against most d6 Sicilian. So his opponent, Edvins Kengis, who I think is Latvian, even though this game was played in Lithuania, chose to play Fischer's repertoire. Kasparov was on the black side of this. So after e4, we have c5 the Sicilian, knight f3, d6. Of course, two other main moves instead of d6 on move 2 for black are knight c6 and e6. And now after d6, we have d4, the open Sicilian, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, and knight to c3. And this is the main line, and probably this is the most common position that arises after 1 e4, c5. Okay, now in this position, black gets to choose the setup, gets to choose the variation. a6 would be the neither of Sicilian, which is objectively best, and best according to the engines and most popular. Then g6 would lead to dragon setups, and Kasparov played knight to c6, which is the classical Sicilian. Now here you can play two main moves with white. Bobby Fischer's move and what was played by Edvins Kengis in the game was bishop c4, the Fischer Sozin. Now, I don't know who Sozin is. I think he was probably a grandmaster, although I'm not sure, but he was definitely not as good as Fischer. And the other option, if you don't play the Fischer Sozin, you can play the Richter Rauser with bishop g5. This is the second most popular move. Now, there are other moves apart from these two, and that's why players with black need to be extremely well prepared in the classical Sicilian. White could play f3, white could play g3, white could play bishop e3, white could play bishop e2, which is the classical keeping in the classical Sicilian. White could play f4, white could play h3, white could play knight b3. These are all good moves and all theoretical moves. So if you play knight c6 on move 5, you better be prepared. But okay, white in this game plays the Fischer Sozin. This is of course a very theoretical variation. Here e6 was played, which is the main move. Kasparov could also have played queen b6, bishop d7, e5, going for a sort of Najdorf territory, or knight a5, threatening to punish the bishop straight away. For example, after knight a5, the main move is bishop e2, just retreating the bishop. But the point is of the Fischer Sozin that you're trying to put pressure on this diagonal straight away, and you're sort of trying to deter black from playing Najdorf setups. So in most of these games, black is going to play the main move e6, going for a Scheveningen setup, which is this small center setup, not going for e5, making this bishop less efficient. Which is why white has to sort of change strategies, and white has to attack using his pawn majority on the king side. Now that could be achieved with f4, which is a common way to undermine this position. And as we know, this bishop is not efficient if there's a pawn on e6, unless white plays either f4, f5, breaks open the position, or unless he manages to break through with g4, g5. In the main lines of the Sozin, or the Fischer Sozin, g4 is the way to play. Now here, bishop e3 is the main line of the Fischer Sozin, and the position continues bishop e7, queen to e2, a6. Other moves are possible, of course. White goes for quick queenside castling, queen to c7, and the position is going to revolve around black playing on the c file, and white simply trying to smash black on the king side. As soon as black castles, g4 is the way to play, and you want to basically break through as soon as possible. Now what black wants to do, black wants to get rid of some central pieces, open up the c file, and then transfer this knight to c5, preferably trade off this b3 bishop, and try to seize control of the queen side. Also at the same time, by trading pieces, making sure that he doesn't lose. So one of the main approaches is knight d4, rook d4, b5, preparing b4, also giving his bishop b7, also after something like g5, preparing for knight d7, knight c5, knight takes b3, and liquidating. So rook g1. On the other hand, White has ideas of queen h5, rook g3, rook h3, and simply mating on h7. Of course, you can see that if, for example, black plays g6 and white plays queen h6 and black continues with a bad move, for example, knight b3 and pawn takes and bishop b7 and rook g3, it's really hard not to get mated in this position. There's basically no good defense. If you move your rook away, then eventually there is no way to escape anymore. So black is the one who has to be extremely careful. After e6, though, white doesn't have to play bishop e3 straight away, which is the main line. White can play what Fischer played, bishop b3. This is known as the Leonhardt variation. It really should be known as the Fischer variation, because Fischer played bishop c4, bishop b3 in all of his Fischer Sozin attacks. Okay, and this simply gets the bishop out of the way. It's not an unprotected piece. You can still play for bishop e3 and the same idea. Okay, bishop e7. Bishop e3, a6 played, swapping knight b5, making queen c7 more efficient, queen e2, queen c7, white castles queen side, black castles king side, all very normal. And here white could prepare his attack with rook hg1. He could also start with f3, but that's kind of slow. Usually people just play g4, and this is what was played in the game. And now Kasparov played an interesting mistake, which has been played after that. It has been played on much higher levels. Of course, Kasparov at 10 or 11 wasn't really a grandmaster yet, although he was very close to grandmaster strength. He played a move that almost no one plays. It has been played 90-something times, but there's really fun refutation to the move. The main move is knight takes d4, and going for this liquidation after rook takes d4, you go for b5, g5, knight d7. This you just have to know in the Fischer Sozin. After rook g1, preparing rook g3, rook h3, and queen h5. Black continues with knight c5, queen h5, g6, queen h6, knight takes bishop, check, a takes bishop, and f5. And in this position, black is supposed to be slightly better. He's going to be defending h7 laterally. He has the bishop pair. His king is slightly unsafe, but if he manages to survive the attack, then the c-file is going to be problematic for white. So this is what people play with black, and this is considered to be quite good. Definitely no issues for black. Instead, Kasparov played knight d7, which preempts the move g5 and sort of moves the knight in advance of the move g5. But there's a very interesting way to refute this. Okay, g5 was played in the game, which is an okay move, doesn't gain a tempo on the knight, but basically transposes. Instead of that, I wonder if you pause the video, try to find an absolutely crushing move for black. For white, excuse me. Okay, so the very crushing idea in this position is knight f5. And the idea is, after knight f5, I'm threatening to take the bishop, so you have to do something. Now, you don't have to take. Of course, knight c5 is the most commonly played move defending the bishop, and in this position black wins 38% of the time. Out of the 8 games played, white won 4. So after knight c5, knight takes e7, getting rid of the bishop, you take with the knight, and the idea was, well, I got rid of my knight for your bishop, you don't have the bishop pair, the d6 pawn is weaker, after I play something like queen d2, I have a lot of pressure on your position, and that's fine. After knight f5, though, if you try to challenge white, and of course if black doesn't know this exact position, then he would take, you play e takes f5, this is now very scary. After e takes f5, the idea is not to recapture with the pawn straight away. It was a liberating sacrifice in a way, because by provoking e f5, you got rid of the defender of the d5 square, so you get to play knight d5, and this is a monstrous knight. Queen d8, you have to do that, defending the bishop. The queen and bishop were attacked. And now g takes f5. And of course, there is ample compensation for the piece. The engine will say that white is slightly better, only slightly better, despite having given up a piece. But I believe this is very hard to play for black. Black has an extra piece, but this extra piece is, let's say, the d7 knight or the c6 knight. And these lines are open. The diagonals are open, the bishop is staring at f7, this knight is ready to jump into b6, c7, take on e7 if need be, and this is just a very, very strong position. Knight a5 is the main move, and rook to g1, knight takes b3, for example, a takes b3, bishop f6, and black could try to hold, but after something like queen h5, it gets very, very tricky. At least black doesn't have an easy time seeking counterplay. So after something like b5, rook g3, and rook h3 is coming. So if you play bishop b7, you simply lose. Rook h3, and now there's no more defense. g6 loses to mate, h6 obviously loses to bishop h6, takes, and yeah, you're just getting mated. Okay, so after knight d7, knight f5 is a pattern you absolutely have to remember in the Fischer Sozin. g5 played instead, knight c5. Now the game is normal. Black should hold a slight edge. Rook h to g1, bishop to d7 developing, rook to g3, all very normal, preparing queen h5, rook h3. And now b5 I think was very interesting. Queen h5 I don't think works, and you don't have to defend against it with g6. So Kasparov played rook fc8, giving his king a square and getting the rook to the c file, which is okay. I think b5 was just stronger, because after queen h5 you don't have to play g6, you can just leave that as it is. So for example, rook ac8, let's try to make the position as dangerous visually as possible. So after rook ac8, let's say rook h3. Now you're okay, you can play h6, and once that's taken, because there is no alternative, you can play g6. And this is a common way to block this attack by white. And in this position I think black is fine, more than fine. Let's say queen e2, you continue with b4, and as soon as this c file starts opening up, I think white is in a world of pain. So after something like knight b1, you can play bishop g5 check, and this seems very scary for white. I don't know if black is winning or not. We're going to see that with an engine, but I think white is in trouble. Okay, after rook g3 though, rook fc8 was played, still okay. Queen h5, and now g6 played. I think instead of g6, just going for the common Fischer Sozin liquidation with knight d4 was better. So knight d4, rook d4, knight b3, a b3, and now g6. And you trade some of the pieces off. And the nice thing is that after queen h6, you always have this idea of bishop f8, and you always have e5 to stop rook h3. So for example, e5 here, let's say rook c4, let's say either queen a5 or queen d8, let's say queen a5. And now it's not that easy to mate black, because I'm stopping rook h3, because I have bishop f8, because I can trade off rooks, and I believe this should be equal. If anything, black should be slightly better, because white has a couple of weaknesses in his position. Okay, but after queen h5, g6 played, queen h6, bishop f8 chasing the queen away, queen h4, okay, knight takes b3 trading off the bishop, takes, bishop e7, f4, which I understand. Again, I don't think white has enough. I don't think white is mating at any point soon, so b5 played. And now white played a strange move. This is the first move I don't understand at all. It just ran into another tempo, so he played queen h6, and Kasparov just played bishop f8, chasing the queen away. Now, arguably the bishop is better on f8 than it was on e7, because it could get to g7, so okay. b4, and now knight takes c6. And here's a very interesting variation, which I spent some time analyzing. In the game, bishop takes c6 was played, seemingly, well, not winning the second piece. Here, after b4, black should already be winning. The question is whether queen h4 or queen h6, bishop f8, queen h4 was the losing tempo. I believe it was, because now black simply gets in b4 for free. And after knight takes c6, Kasparov took bishop takes c6, which I couldn't understand. I started wondering what was wrong with bc3, because now if you move your knight, I can take the pawn for free. If you don't move your knight, then I just win two pieces. And I analyzed two variations. One of them is extremely interesting. One of them is bishop d4, simply giving up a piece. If you take... okay, pause the video, see what happens if queen takes c6. Okay, if queen takes c6, if black gets greedy, then he loses. This is actually a mate in 4 with a very common pattern. Queen takes pawn, king takes, and now simply rook check, and you're going to mate on h8. You could delay that with bishop h6, but eventually you just get mated. So this bishop is very strong. So bishop d4 would actually be a trap. And after bishop d4, you probably just take on on b2, king takes b2, or bishop takes b2, and you play bishop bishop to g7, and after takes, rook h3, you could play rook h8, and probably black is just winning again. The other option after bc3 was knight d4, saving the piece, and now not takes on b2 immediately, but queen a5 is very interesting. And after queen a5, I was looking at king b1, pawn takes b2, king takes b2, and e5, stopping rook h3, attacking the knight, and preparing queen f3, queen c3, excuse me, check. And I think this would be crushing. So after knight takes c6, I think bc3 was better than bishop c6, but bishop c6 was winning all the same. Okay, rook h3, and now it seems scary, but after h5, gh6, bc3, he just wins a piece. After bishop takes c6, if you try saving the piece, I think I just play, if you try, for example, knight b1 or knight e2, then I can just take on e4, I think, and you're not defending this, I think. I think that just loses, so he had to give up the piece. So after bishop c6, rook h3, excuse me, h5, takes en passant, bc3, queen f6, threatening all sorts of nasty things with bishop d4, king h7 played, bishop d4, and now he is threatening mate in 1, but Kasparov can delay that for a second, or he can defend a move later because he has a free tempo, so cb2 check, king b2, and now he plays e5. And this is sufficient defense. Fe5. In the game, bishop e4 was played. You don't want to allow, you don't want to lose your queen. Of course, if he'd taken here with the bishop, then you have to give up your queen. Otherwise, you get mated on h8. Or you have to give up a bishop. This would... No, yeah, then you get mated on g7, excuse me. Okay, so fe5, bishop e4, e6. Now it gets very tricky. Because in this position, again, a mate is threatened, so you have to do something. But white has, well, undefended the c2 pawn. So again, Kasparov can delay mate with a queen check. So queen takes c2 check, king a3, and now a discovered check, d5 check, but it gets very crazy after pawn to e7. And now I think this is a critical position. Now there is no easy defense. You have to give up something. For the moment, black is still a piece up and the pawn up. Or, no, excuse me, the pawn situation is equal. So he has to give a piece back unless he wants to get mated. So bishop takes e7, check. Attacking the queen, attacking the king. And critically, after queen takes e7, finally mate on g7 is not threatened anymore. Well, mate on f7 is threatened instead, but okay. So black has to defend against mate. So if queen takes pawn, that would be checkmate. So queen to c7, defending. So if queen f7, and white gives up. He trades the queens. I think the endgame is simply lost for white if the rooks remain on the board. And it became very interesting to analyze this endgame. I'm not going to bore you too much, but my conclusion is that should both pairs of rooks remain on the board, it should be an easy win for black. The opposite color bishop endgame was a draw in most cases, and one rook against bishop was also winning for black. So I think white should have declined the queen trade, although that's not easy because it seems that white is getting mated himself. I was looking at a move like queen b4, but then simply rook b8, and after you move your queen somewhere, I have a ton of pressure. So queens got traded off, rook c7, rook g3, rook to c2, rook f1, and now of course the f7 pawn is threatened, but if black remains careful and plays sensible moves, he should win easily. So f5, h4, king h6, bishop e3 check, king h7, rook f to g1, rook to c3. And in this position after h5, there of course is a ton of pressure on this pawn. And you have to be careful. If you take and he checks you, play king h8, then bishop to e4 wins. And if you play king to h6, well, then you can't. So this would be a huge blunder. So this would just lose the game. Okay, so instead of that, after h5, Kasparov played g5. I think there was an interesting option of playing simply rook b8, because you're going to lose this pawn anyway. So after something like hg6, you play king g8, of course, not king h8, because bishop e4 wins. bishop d4, excuse me. And after either king a2 or bishop f4, let's say king a2, you know, take, and I think this endgame should be winning, but it's not really clear. The problem is that if we trade the rooks off, this is a pawn of the wrong color. I have the bishop of the wrong color corner, so if this is the only thing black has at the end, it's going to be a draw. So black needs to either keep some of the pawns on the board or the rooks on the board. So here's just some of my analysis. Bishop f4, rook a3 check, and eventually I just couldn't decline the rook trades. And in this position, I think it's a draw. Because white can control both the f5 pawn and the d4 pawn with his one bishop on the diagonal, black is going to eventually trade off the g6 pawn for something. The problem is that once my a pawn remains on the board, it's going to be a draw, and this should be an easy draw. The problem is now that once the black king reaches the f pawn, the bishop could just sacrifice itself. So for example, let's say we reach this position and he plays something. Now white could just give up the bishop, and this is a clear draw. Now there is no way to win. So my conclusion for most opposite colored bishop endgames in this one was that they were a draw. Instead of that, Kasparov played g5, bishop takes g5, rook takes g3, rook takes g3, rook to g8. And this now looks like a fairly easy draw. Again, doesn't seem that the rooks are going to remain on the board. In fact, they get traded off instantly, and now this is just hopeless. Again, this pawn will draw if it's the only one remaining. This bishop can blockade both the f pawn and the d pawn along one diagonal. It doesn't matter if you lose this pawn or not, so it should really be an easy draw. And in fact, I believe, yeah, here they agreed to a draw. There's just no way to win. Everything is blockaded, and yeah, it should objectively be a draw. Okay, let's run the engine through this game just briefly. Let's just see some interesting points. I've added the evaluation bar on the right side of the screen. Okay, I wonder about knight f5. I mean, I know it's a theoretical move, but I wonder what the engine thinks is the exact valuation. Okay, the engine thinks knight f5 is the best move, and it says plus 1.1. So it's almost theory. And after pawn takes, knight d5, the engine says plus 1.1. So that's very, very, very strong. I don't think people should be playing knight d7. Okay, then let's have a look at this position after queen h5, where Kasparov played g6. Knight d4 was better. And after knight d4, as I said, this is very thematic in the Fischer Sozin. If you've ever analyzed any Fischer games or other games in the Fischer Sozin, then this is, all of these patterns should be very familiar to you. ab3, g6, queen h6, e5, all very normal. Okay, and that should be equal. Okay, now this position after b5, where I think white lost the game with queen h6 allowing bishop f8. It's still much better for black regardless of what white does. The engine wants to play f5. Is that scary though? f5, b4. And now it just doesn't follow up. Now f5 was played. What for? Okay, knight e2, knight d4. It just seems that black is completely winning. So now it changes its mind to -2 point something. Okay, but queen h5 seems to be even worse. Bishop f8, free tempo. And now after b4, yeah, it's exactly one piece. In the game, knight c6 was played. The engine just gives up and plays f5. Okay, knight c6. And now, yeah, b takes c3 seems better. But bishop c6 is okay, what was played in the game. After bc3, yeah, bishop d4 is the trickiest move. The engine wants to do that. And okay, instead of my idea of cb2, king b2, bishop g7, which, let's see if that was good or not. I wanted to play bishop g7. What's wrong with that? Oh, okay. Okay, I just blundered. Okay, after bishop g7, rook h3. Seems very strong because white is going to win the h7 pawn. So instead of that, if bishop d4, you just play e5 straight away. It's sufficiently defended, and okay, okay. But bishop c6, rook h3, okay, and now this is all fine. Fe5, bishop takes e4, black doesn't have a big advantage, but his position seems easier to play. e6, queen takes c2. e6 was a blunder. After bishop, after bishop e4, e6, and the engine says black is winning. Instead, white should have played rook f1, which I understand, simply attacking f7. So at least you get some counterplay. So after rook f1, queen c2, king a1, and how are you not getting mated? And what's queen d2? Okay, let's see, queen f7, king h8. What's wrong with e6? Ah, okay, excuse me, queen d2 was attacking the bishop. Okay. And now basically black is going to have a perpetual with rook c1 check. Okay, after e6, black is winning, so king a3, d5 check is correct, e7 is correct, bishop takes is correct, queen takes is correct, queen c7 only move, queen takes, rook takes. Yeah, and black is better. Let's just see this position after h5. The engine likes rook b8, which wasn't played, which I was analyzing, and it actually thinks black can win this. I wonder how. hg6, king g8, all correct. King a2, correct. Aha, I took rook b takes b3, which the engine thinks is -2. Instead it plays rook c2 check, which is -2.1. Okay. Now it changes its mind, and now it goes back. So I don't understand it. So let's play rook b takes b3. Still says -0.2. Bishop f4 is correct. Rook a3 is correct. King b2 is correct. Now I played d4. The engine wants to play rook b3 check. And I don't see how it's making progress. It says -3 point something, but it doesn't make progress. -4. Okay, bishop d3 is interesting. Bishop e5. Check. Yeah, I don't think the engine... It wants to give up a pawn with rook d4. I don't know. The engine doesn't seem to be winning this easily. Let's see. Okay, g5 played in the game, and just a draw. Okay, but rook b8 was definitely one of the best attempts, but let's just make sure about the position I was looking at after d4. Takes, takes, takes. Once all the rooks gets traded off, the engine says -1. But yeah, this is a draw. It doesn't know how to win. Let's see if there's a table-based position for this. Unknown. What does that mean? Okay, there's no table base for this. The engine says -0.7, but it should be a draw. So yeah, I mean, it was a very interesting position theoretically for Fischer Sozin players, and I think it was very instructive how both sides had to put pressure on their opponent's position. It was about who goes quicker, but all of White's threats were sort of futile, and he didn't make any real threats. Black didn't make any threats at all, and just seemed to snuff out all the play for White and then get a better position. He had some play on the c-file and then had some chances with bc3, but missed them. So Kasparov not at his best at 11 yet. He is about to get better though. Let me know what you think about the game. Hope you liked it. Any feedback is appreciated, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.